Good afternoon, everybody. My lecture is actually called Sisters, Sisters and Other Family Members. I want to start by reminding you of the theme that I set out at length in my first lecture and to which I wish to adhere. And that theme was that there needs to be a reassertion of the place of morality in our private as well as our public politicians' lives, and especially so when there is an overlap between the two spheres. The overlap occurs where public policy issues like taxation, childcare and employment are affected by relationships within the family. I want to ask today why in English law we treat siblings less favourably than married or civil partners, and why we do not expect adults to maintain their parents or their grandparents in return for the keep that was extended to them in their youth. One has to wonder why English law only attaches support obligations to parents of young children and to those in a sexual relationship. There's an old song from the Bing Crosby movie, White Christmas, there it is, that runs like this. I haven't quite got the guts to sing it to you, but some of you will know it. The Beverly Sisters sang it. Sisters, sisters, never such devoted sisters. Never had to have a chaperone, no sir. I'm here to keep my eye on her, caring, sharing, every little thing we're wearing. Many men have tried to split us up, but no one can. Lord help the mister who comes between me and my sister, and Lord help the sister who comes between me and my man. Sadly, in the case I'm about to describe, the caring and sharing may come to naught, and it is the minister, not the mister, the minister who's come between the sisters. Miss Joyce and Miss Sybil Burden of Wiltshire have lived together their entire lives and are in their late 80s. They remain single. They cared for their parents and two aunts to the end and did not allow them to go into a home. Their Wiltshire house and other assets are worth about $590,000 each. When one of the sisters dies, the survivor, wishing to remain in her home, will have to pay in inheritance tax 40% of the excess over the exemption limit, which is currently $315,000, namely about $108,000 each, according to my last calculations. Not having the cash in hand, this would mean having to sell the home and might render the survivor homeless. This having to pay immediately on death will occur because they are not spouses or lesbians in a civil partnership who are exempt from the inheritance tax until the second death. Every year for 32 years at budget time, the Mrs. Burden have written to the current Chancellor of the Exchequer to protest and ask for a change in the law, but to no avail. Their case was strengthened when the inheritance tax exemption that had once only been granted to spouses was extended to civil partners after the enactment of the Civil Partnership Act 2004. To quote the sisters in a letter they wrote to me, "We have been fighting for 32 years to gain the same rights as regards inheritance tax as married couples, and now homosexual and lesbian couples. But our appeal was completely ignored. There was not a single member of the House of Commons raised a finger to help us. The very thing we had been asking for so many years was given to homosexuals and lesbians without a fight." End of quote. This was their response to an amendment to give family members who live together the same exemptions during the passage of the Civil Partnership Act, which failed in the Commons, although successful in the Lords. The sisters have tried every legal way to reduce inheritance tax. This culminated in their appeal to the European Court of Human Rights Grand Chamber, alleging discrimination under Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of status. The right being affected is Article 1 of Protocol 1, prohibiting deprivation of property. The Grand Chamber found against the sisters on the ground that the state was entitled to differentiate between marriage and other relationships from the perspective of tax. This argument is a weak one, given that the clear blue line that used to exist was blurred once the exemption was extended to gay couples. Moreover, only 4% of persons actually have sufficient wealth to come into the inheritance tax bracket. So an extension to family members like these sisters may not have cost much, especially as it is only deferral of the total tax until the point of death of the second sister that is in issue, not absolute exemption with consequent loss to the Treasury. What I'm talking about is a rollover of the inheritance tax until the second sister dies, like married couples get, not getting rid of it. The government's stated policy in family matters is to promote stable long-term relationships, even if outside the framework of traditional marriage. To quote the sisters again, "We did our duty by the previous generation, but it all counts for nothing now with this Labour government. They are totally corrupt. Their only concern is for people living in sin. We have lived a blameless life, always paying our taxes, etc." Says the sister, "I am terribly upset by this, and I just don't know what we're going to do. We have spent our lives looking after people and never once done anything wrong. And now we are punished for doing the right thing. This government is always going out of its way to give rights to people who have done nothing to deserve them. If we were lesbians, we would have all the rights in the world. But we are sisters, and it seems we have no rights at all." End of quote. It is too late for them to rearrange their property to avoid tax, because it would have to be done at least 7 years before death. It would involve guessing which of the two would be the survivor, and in any case, stamp duty of about 20,000 would have to be paid. As it stands, half of the property would be chargeable for inheritance tax. What remained of that half would pass to the surviving sister, and her estate would have to pay inheritance tax again on everything she left on her death, i.e., it seems as if tax is payable twice over. It is an odd refusal of relief by the government, given that it should be policy to keep people housed, to recognise the arrangements that people want to make for each other, and respect the elderly and their carers. Other cases, such as the daughter who looks after her father for years but does not inherit, are similar. Or if she does inherit, the tax has to be paid at that point. There is surely a case for changing the law for carer situations, even if not for siblings. The Treasury, when I raised this a couple of times, was concerned that revenue would be lost. But it is only deferral that is in issue, and the door would not be open to every two people seeking to avoid inheritance tax by living together. The sensible reform would be to grant deferral of inheritance tax to any two family members who are codependent and are within the prohibited degrees, so that the option of civil partnership or marriage is not open to them. The extraordinary thing about our tax system is the way in which it privileges sexual relationships of any variety above all others. The government argument was that the current inheritance tax exemption exists to promote stable, committed, heterosexual and homosexual relationships. This is a weak argument when no children are involved, for there is no particular interest of the state otherwise. But given that this is the policy, the stable relationship of two sisters and their plight on the death of one is of no less value to society. Indeed, their 82 years together must put them in the top tiny % of lasting relationships. Before the European Court of Human Rights, the government argued that the sibling relationship was different because it was one of consanguinity, not of choice, as sexual relationships are. The relevance of this is hard to see, but in any case, the sisters had chosen to live together and care for each other. Their dependency was and is as great as any married couple, and their commitment far greater than most. Siblings have no rights and responsibilities in relation to each other, but that is because the law gives them no framework for creating them, as we shall see shortly. The government was actually holding against the Burden sisters their inability to enter a civil partnership. Marriage, indeed, has special responsibilities, but marriage has lost its uniqueness in that regard. The government yielded to the insistence by gay people when it pressed for same-sex couples to be treated in the same way as married couples. But once marital rights, such as pension rights, rights to take key medical decisions and so on, are extended, there is no good reason not to extend them to others in long-term, caring and stable relationships who happen to be related by blood. And now grandparents. Grandparents today now put up a strong campaign and profile. There are many lobbying organisations for them, ranging from Age Concern to Grandparents Plus, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Grandchildren, the Grandparents Association, and so on. They have been brought into being in part because of the grief of grandparents who lose contact with their grandchildren after the separation or divorce of the parents of those children, and in part because there are so many older people in our society now. In an earlier lecture in this series about family relationships, I asked rhetorically, am I turning into Mary Whitehouse? In this lecture, I might say, well, yes, indeed, I'm turning into an old person myself, hence my newfound concern. These groups listed here campaign for increased legal support for contact or custody orders reflecting the 1 million grandparents who lose contact after the parents separate. And that is apparently 4 out of 10 of those affected by their children's divorce. The grandparents want contact with the grandchildren, and they want to be appointed carers of grandchildren who would otherwise be placed with adopters or fosterers if circumstances are very difficult after the breakup of the parents. Even where the family is intact, grandparents are increasingly a source of childcare because the mother is going out to work when she has dependent children. And especially when the mother is single, she needs the help of, usually, her parents. Often the single mother's mother is also a single woman herself. And this scenario is usually associated with poverty, passing on from generation to generation. Current government policy is to encourage mothers to go back to work. Hence, the government encourages grandparental childcare, because there is insufficient, affordable other childcare available, albeit that the contribution made by grandparents is not compensated financially. Grandparent carers will get national insurance credit towards the state pension from April 2011. And there are calls for childcare credits to be payable to grandparent carers. Government policy is favourable towards the benefits of grandparents' involvement, even if the law does not recognise them to the same extent. In Scotland, there is an official Charter for Grandchildren, which states that they can expect to know their family history and that courts should take into account the love and support that grandparents can offer. And you can find this on the website scotland.gov.uk. Grandparent contact is generally regarded as good, although there are suspicious voices that see it as a backdoor way for a father who is estranged from his former wife and has no contact rights with the children to get them through his own parents. This reflects the hostilities attached to the Fathers for Justice campaigns. Cynics might also say that rights for grandparents suit the state, flagging up concern for responsible parenting after divorce, keeping fathers involved, and saving on caring and childcare facilities. Some research indicates that grandparents may not have the energy or affection for their grandchildren that they are popularly supposed to have. The grandparents may be party to the feud between the parents. There may not be enough weekends in an older child's life for visits to both parents and grandparents. But other research finds that grandparent involvement correlates with good outcomes in education and conduct, good outcomes in emotional and behavioural issues. That's research by Anne Buchanan in 2008. Probably relations with grandparents, good or indifferent, stay much the same before and after divorce. All are agreed that the contact should be the right of the child, not the grandparents, and that court litigation is not the way to solve the disagreements, but negotiation and mediation. The law on this is fairly weak. Grandparents can apply for contact with their grandchildren during divorce under Section 8 of the Children Act 1989, but they need the leave of the court to do this before they start on it under Section 10, subsection 9, unless the resident parent agrees. So it's a double process, a filter to prevent vexatious and interfering applications by relatives and other third parties. Grandparents can get leave if they meet criteria about connection with the child, harm from disrupting existing contact, and if the child is in care, the plans of the local authority and the wishes of the parents have to be taken into account. The court is unlikely to make an order enforcing contact with the grandparents if this is against the wishes of the parents, who are, after all, the primary carers. Enforcement is and would be difficult. Campaigners would like to remove the need to ask for leave before proceeding to the substantive action. And in a green paper published by the Department of Children, Schools and Families just a week ago, the government promised that they will do this. There is speculation as to how Article 8 of the Human Rights Act might affect the situation. It grants the right to respect for family life. The general attitude seems to be that the parent's family life with the child would be of more importance, and that the grandparents would come second, unless the child had actually had his or her main home with the grandparents. In a legal clash between parents and grandparents, the former have the upper hand. The same attitude has been taken in the United States. The leading case is Troxell and Granville, decided in 2000 by the US Supreme Court. Tommy Granville and Brad Troxell were the unmarried parents of two daughters. When their relationship ended, Brad often took the children to see his parents. He committed suicide 2 years later, but the children stayed in touch with the grandparents until Tommy, their mother, married someone else and wanted to stop the paternal grandparents' visits. The grandparents of Brad, the parents of Brad, relied on a statute of Washington State, which granted third parties the right to file for visitation. The Washington court ruled the statute void for constitutional reasons. Then the case went to the Supreme Court of the USA, which agreed. The court ruled that parents should be assumed to be acting in the best interests of their children, and the state should not inject itself into the private realm of the family to question the decisions of the parents. Nevertheless, most American states do have visitation statutes broad enough to encompass applications by grandparents. But in practice, that contact is granted, or visitation as they call it, only if it is in the best interests of the child, or even on a higher level, that the child will suffer harm if it's not allowed. Grandparents and the elderly are a growing problem, whether giving or receiving care. By 2021, there will be more over 65s than under 16s in the UK, according to government publication Social Trends. There are 14 million grandparents in the UK, of whom 1.5 million are quite young, under 50, and 7 million under 65. That means obviously half of them are over 65. Because the middle classes give birth at an older age, they tend to be older grandparents with more of an age gap between the generations. Working class women are more likely to become grandparents before they reach the age of 50 than middle class women. And working class women are twice as likely to reach the status of grandparents before they're 60. Working class grandparents are more likely to belong to four-generation families because of the smaller gap between each generation, who are amongst the poorest. Many single grandparents have children who are also single parents, 38% of grandparents, that is. Because of the reliance on grandparents to help out with childcare for the working mother, this places particular burdens on grandparents who may need to work themselves but feel obliged to help out the younger generation. 1 in 100 grandchildren actually live full-time with the grandparents. This is all related to the poverty of the elderly. The elderly, especially grandparents, are taking on burdens which deprive them of their own chance to continue to earn a living, for which they are not compensated, and the care they give to their grandchildren is no doubt at some cost to them. The single grandparent of the children of a single mother is in a particularly difficult financial position. In this way, the disruption caused by divorce or separation spreads its ripples through the generations. The hardship experienced by the single mother affecting her extended family if they help out. There is a dearth of affordable childcare and an attempt to meet it by conscripting grandmothers. 82% of children receive some care from their grandparents. 5 million grandparents spend 3 days a week caring for them. 1/3 of families depend on the grandparents for childcare, according to the government publication Social Trends in April 2009. The mother is more likely to work if her mother is alive to help out. 47% of single parents depend on grandparents for care, and the value of care given by grandparents has been valued at £3.9 billion. Grandparents are the support of the future of their grandchildren. We read about the selfish generation of the baby boomers who have left the present generation in a much worse state. But if you look at what grandparents do for their children and grandchildren, this is not actually the case. 31% of grandparents save to help their children and grandchildren with the future house purchase, and no doubt help out with higher education as well. 70% of grandparents give financial support to their grandchildren, and £470 million per annum is contributed by grandparents to their grandchildren's trust funds. £4 billion of legacies skip a generation and go straight to the grandchildren. So I don't think my generation can really be accused of neglecting the present generation. The situation may get worse. There will soon be fewer earners to support the growing retired population, according to the World Bank in a paper called Averting the Old Age Crisis. 20% of pensioners are below the poverty line. 1 in 6 claim to be lonely. 1 million of them spent Christmas Day 2004 alone. 4 out of 10 of those admitted to hospital are malnourished, and it's no surprise that 6 out of 10 of those become even more malnourished while they're there. Older people are being encouraged to work, and there is new legislation giving some protection against ageism, and there will be more in the Equality Bill going through Parliament at the moment. But a mandatory retirement age may still be justified as proportionate by the state, according to the European Court of Justice in a case called Heyday in 2009, currently before the High Court for further determination. It's actually a very difficult situation, this retirement, because if you take my business, university teaching, if the old professors like me didn't retire, there would never be any new thinking and new people to take the slots that are vacant. So I do actually think that teachers anyway should move on at retirement age. But if grandparents are burdened by childcare, they're unlikely to be able to take advantage of increased employment rights. And when unemployment is high, there's still a tendency to give jobs to the younger rather than the older. In return for everything that grandparents do, should there not be an obligation to keep them in the family and to keep parents and reciprocate the care that the grandparents gave to their children and grandchildren in their youth? From the time of Elizabeth I, the Poor Law required the infirm and the poverty-stricken to rely on their families, who were fined if the help was not forthcoming. Sons had to support their parents and grandparents throughout their lives, daughters until they married. This was only repealed in 1948 by the National Assistance Act, Section 42 of which limited the duties to support of spouse and children. It was the law in Scotland until 1985 and Holland until 1970. There are suggestions in the United States that there should be what they call a filial responsibility law. And in, for example, South Dakota, children have been made to pay for the medical care of their parents. And I often wonder when I hear about elderly folk who die alone in an apartment or are neglected in hospital, and after they're dead the children suddenly pop up and say, why didn't the state take care of them? I do sometimes wonder, well, where were you? In France, there is a limited duty to support members of the wider family, known as l'obligation alimentaire, if parents can't, and with priority to one's own spouse and children. This topic is linked, of course, with the enormous expense now incurred by older people who need residential care. They receive no state help if they have a house or savings of more than 23,000, and this is de facto a burden on their families, either because they have to pay or because they are deprived of an inheritance which might have come to them, but which has had to be spent on the care of the parents. Singapore has a Maintenance of Parents Act 1995, which provides that anyone over 60 who's unable to maintain themselves adequately can apply for an order that their child should do so through periodical payments or a lump sum. In Singapore, the Tribunal for the Maintenance of Parents may make an order, if it is just and equitable to do so, having regard to all the circumstances, including, for example, if the parent had dissipated his or her resources, or had neglected or abused the child from whom he or she claims. Unfortunately, tempting though it seems, the possibility of switching support of indigenous adults away from the state to their children and grandchildren is not possible now. To try and get children to maintain grandparents or adult children to maintain parents would be seen as an attempt to cut state expenditure. It would give rise to arguments within families about the sharing of help and resources. It might deprive older people of state benefits now available to them, and it would certainly become a burden on the women in the family whose independence and career progression would take a setback. Many parents are in fact cared for by their children, and others might feel it humiliating to have to seek a court order to that end. Broken marriages and geographical mobility mean that there are many parents who are not nearly as close to their children as they might be in better circumstances. Indeed, are estranged. There will be children without resources or who have chosen careers that paid little and were not careers that their parents urged them to choose. Moreover, now that higher education equates with debt, the reality is that parents will be supporting their own children well into their adulthood and possibly taking responsibility for the debts of the children rather than the other way round. There are, however, many adult children who do care for their parents, and some hard cases where an inheritance is promised but the will is not made, and when the parent dies the child is disinherited and maybe loses the home because another person is the heir. It is especially odd that a cohabitant who lives with a man and is kept by him has a claim under the Inheritance Provision for Family Independence Act 1975. So if an old man is living with a younger woman and he dies, she will have a claim from his estate because she was dependent on him. Whereas a carer daughter who looked after the father does not have a claim because she is not, as the 1975 Act requires, being maintained by him. So the mistress is preferred to the daughter. Thus does English law continue to prefer the idle sexual partner over the deserving family member. Which takes me back to the theme I've illustrated in the previous 3 lectures, and which is amply illustrated if you've been reading the papers this weekend about the vast payouts that will no doubt go to the lady whose favours were enjoyed by various members of the English football team, which is that if you have the good fortune to have a sexual relationship, no matter how brief, with a man of celebrity and wealth, cash will shower down on you sooner or later. But if you are a hard-working, committed, devoted daughter or son who cares for a parent, or 2 sisters, the state will completely ignore you and you're not regarded as deserving at all. Isn't it time to restore the obligations and value of the blood relationship to a level at least that of the sexual relationship? Thank you very much, and I've got time for questions.